Hello and welcome to Chapter 12 in the Struggle for Democracy. It's our lecture on the presidency, and it will be a longer video lecture, lots to cover. We have our study guide questions going from 16 through 30. I'll also give you a hint on 31, as well as we have an essay question. The essay question, as well as presidential popularity, as well as executive orders, are all going to be part of the lecture time that we do. And here's an example of the 21st century presidential powers and accomplishments. Barack Obama, after the cooling off of relations with Cuba in the early 60s, here he is with a picture of Che Guevara behind him, opening up an embassy in Havana, establishing relationships with one of our closest neighbors. So let's look at the theme of this chapter, which is the expanding powers of the presidency and how we got there. So Article 2 of the Constitution lists the powers as very limited. It's typically roles to play, and study guide question number 31 says, how did the framers look at the presidency? And the answer is, it was very vague. It was not necessarily things to do the way it was in Article 1. It was more hats to wear, roles to play. So Commander in Chief of the Armed Forces, solicit some opinion. So you did these roles. So here's President Washington fulfilling his role as Commander in Chief, reviewing the troops, which he could easily do on an afternoon near the Potomac. Now, today, we have 1.4 million active troops, 1.1 million reserve. That's 2.5 million troops deployed all over the world. It actually amounts to 0.7% of the entire population of the United States. That gives you a hint about the expanding role of the presidency. So let's start with the beginning, which is what we call the dormant presidency, when the powers were just kind of sitting there but not being used. So George Washington did a good job of popularizing the presidency. He was a war hero, and he also ended his presidency after 2 terms and kind of set a tone for that. Now, Thomas Jefferson, who was not part of the Federalists and created a new party of Democratic Republicans, took over in 1801. And despite being very states' rights oriented, Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the country, which led obviously to it being a massive industrial power. James Polk, 1845 to 49, but in his short term as presidency, in his war with Mexico, he expanded the United States. Mexico lost over half of its territory in the American Mexican War. And part of that is today California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and parts of Utah, Colorado, and Nebraska. And they got $15 million. That's what the Mexicans got in the 1840s for that. So think about what Jefferson and Polk did in terms of creating plenty of land for plenty of people to become an industrial power. Then Abraham Lincoln really was the beginning of the expanded powers of the presidency when he declared that the keeping of the Union together was more important than the Constitution. He suspended habeas corpus. He did many things for the powers of the presidency. So now we look at the 20th century transformation. So this is when the presidency really took off, and this is the whole theme of the chapter. Teddy Roosevelt is really a progressive era presidency. He called it the Bull Moose Party, was one of the parties he formed, a third party movement. He was good about breaking up monopolies and the starting of our national park system. Woodrow Wilson, a Princeton College president, becomes president of the United States and leads us through a kind of liberal era of fair play by creating the Federal Reserve Board and controlling the money supply and the Fair Trade Commission. But he expanded the powers of the presidency because he led us through World War I and really wanted us to have a larger role in the world. Franklin Roosevelt was the overseer of the Democratic realignment that brought Democrats back into power because of the Depression, created his New Deal, Works Progress Association, and expanded the powers of the presidency during World War II. And that leads to Franklin Roosevelt in study guide question number 24, which president who is most associated with the rise of the modern era presidency, and that's FDR. John Kennedy, 60 to 63, short-lived, but he created the new frontier, a race to the moon, Peace Corps, the use of television, and the start of the Civil Rights Movement. And then Ronald Reagan brings us back to conservatism in Reaganomics, ends the Cold War, peace through strength, and messaging directly to people. So here's some examples. Teddy Roosevelt, considered very much a man of the people, someone who really was highly popular and really brought power through popularity. And here is Franklin Delano Roosevelt as part of the Works Progress Association. Now, Franklin's not in the picture here, but they're building the Hoover Dam. So these massive industrial projects to get America working again. Here's John Kennedy laying out his new frontier. Notice the space race at the bottom and just challenging us to go to the moon and all the jobs that were created off of that. And then you had his growth in international affairs. Here is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is about averting nuclear missiles going to Cuba. And then that precipitated kind of the closing of the relationship with Cuba that Barack Obama opened up again decades later. Here's Nixon in 1972 with Zhou Enlai, the prime minister or minister in China, opening up a new era as we discovered there are 1 billion people in China, and that's worth getting to know and interact with. And here's Ronald Reagan, hailer of the conservative movement, with Gorbachev in Red Square and his famous line at the big speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So these presidents in the 20th century greatly expanded the power both domestically, Franklin Roosevelt probably the best example, and internationally, and then Roosevelt and Reagan and Nixon. So, how important are individual presidents? Well, strong people in the presidency do create more powers, and those powers seem to stick. But also, presidents who get put into interesting situations like world wars and depressions also use powers, and then they stick as well. So, our increased presidential power has been well supported by Congress, been supported by the public. So the courts have even stepped in. So this increase has been well agreed to help us cope with the modern age. So here's the 21st century presidency, which includes essay number 2, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump. And study guide question number 23 is which president in the modern era actually was impeached and had a trial in the Senate? And that is William Jefferson Clinton, Bill Clinton. But we'll talk more about them during our time in class. So here is Bush as the war leader from terrorism in 2001 and Dick Cheney next to him. So the powers and roles of the president. This is a cartoon from the New Yorker, I believe it's 2013, where they're writing down, oh yeah, let's give the executive the right to rain down death on high. Clearly, the framers did not envision the great roles that presidents have played over the years. So it's very much been an adapting to those roles over time and maybe even limiting them. I think some people feel that we've kind of gone too far in that world. So, chief of state, here's some very specific things. The president as chief of state is the symbolic leader of the country and is supposed to bring us together. These would be the duties of a prime minister in another country. And then the president also does ceremonial duties like greeting foreign dignitaries, which is what a monarch or a crown does. So the president is unique in the sense that, on the one, he is not running the Congress. On the other hand, he is both the crown and the prime minister all at the same time. So it's a very powerful role. Now, the president is domestic policy leader, and part of this is that he is supposed to bring to Congress once a year in his State of the Union, which is number 22. What is the State of the Union? This is a constitutionally mandated where the president presents his legislative proposals to Congress. And in the Budget Act of 1921, that passed the Constitution. Now, under law, he is supposed to present a budget of the United States. So he brings the initial budget to Congress, and he's supposed to provide leadership on major legislation. This is all new stuff, the Budget Act and major legislative leadership that's happened in the 20th century. Now, because of the Great Depression in 29 through, I'd say, early 40s, After the Great Depression and World War II was the Employment Act, which requires the president to present an economic plan to keep the economy strong. And even conservative presidents like Bush and Reagan and Bush have had to step in and be an economic leader, a pretty direct economic leader. So this is what was a come talk to Congress once a year has now turned into a huge deal. The chief executive initially was, well, let's just make sure the laws are executed. But executive orders, and this is going to be a focus of our time together in class, and number 16 on the list, how do presidents exercise control over the federal bureaucracy, the people that work for him but are not politically connected? And the answer is he uses executive orders to do that. And these are some examples that I'll get into when we have our class. Bush brought back the doctrine of the unitary executive, which says that the President of the United States and the Vice President have unilateral control over the entire bureaucratic branch. And so, even though that control is limited, that essentially people that work there for years and years by merit are not necessarily aligned with the party or the politics of the presidency, there are many things that you can do to influence, not control, but influence. Now, foreign policy and military leader. So this was an almost non-existent role at the time of George Washington, but today the foreign policy leader of the free world. Create ambassadorships. Notice the one with Obama in Havana. Conduct diplomacy, do treaties, and then executive agreements. Number 27, examples of the president being a foreign policy leader is done through executive agreements, visit to other countries, negotiating treaties. So these are three things listed for here that all are part of the president's power. And so executive agreements are kind of like executive orders domestically, executive agreements are international. Then the president is commander in chief. So the president is the head of the armed forces. So we have a politically run military to make sure the military doesn't get too much power. And we used to be very kind of sensitive to the fact that we only fought a war in a defensive effort to save American soil. I think that would be World War II and the attack on Hawaii. But since then, since Vietnam and Iraq and Iran, I think now we see the notion that we have to take military might to prevent the growing threat of the communism or ISIS. So, War Powers Act, passed in 1973, was very much Congress's wanting to take some power back from the president. And number 17 is, when was the last time Congress declared war? Last time Congress declared war was World War II. I think December 9th. Roosevelt went to the Congress and that said December 8th will be a day that lives in infamy, and we went to war. That's the last time we actually declared war under the Constitution. And the commander in chief has a lot of emergency powers, and those emergency powers exist for good reason. If you look at Zero Dark 30, for example, the ability of the president to conduct intelligence and to eventually infiltrate, capture, and kill Osama bin Laden was done through his emergency and ability to move troops from point A to point B whenever he needs them. So here is Barack Obama reaching out to over 1 billion Muslims in the world, trying to get. This is in Egypt, and so he's hoping that he would warm relations with the Egyptians. But one of the reasons this picture is here is, despite his best efforts, a new regime was elected, and Egypt is a very harsh autocratic country today, and we don't have good relations with them. So the president is the leader of the party. Now, I would say that presidents, this is low on their list. Presidents are all about getting themselves reelected and then securing their legacy. So, Donald Trump is technically the leader of the Republican Party. So the president's support system, president, most powerful person in the world, has an incredible support system behind him, of which the White House staff is the key to that. The executive office of the president, the vice presidency, and the cabinet. So the chief of staff, question number 19, who is the president's right hand that supervises the president's staff? And that is the chief of staff, probably one of the most powerful people in the country. Typically, that job is extremely stressful. I mean, it supervises all the people that the president has employed to get things done. This is not a competitive structure, it is a hierarchical structure. And so the chief of staff's at the top, and then the national security advisor, which advises presidents on international affairs, the domestic policy advisor, advising the president on the economy, the press secretary, who stands out there every day in the press room talking about the presidency and what's going on, and then various special assistants and other types of advisors like economic advisors. So the chief of staff and then the NSA and DPA are at the top of the heap, and everybody else is kind of underneath it. So the president has his office, his team called the executive team, the Office of Management and Budget, number 29, who gauges the cost of a proposed bill. Office of Management and Budget, OMB. OMB helps the president prepare the budget. So the OMB is all about the money and making predictions about the money and reports about the money. The Council on Economic Advisors, number 28. What is the role of the Council of Economic Advisors? They advise the president on economic matters. They've been around since right after World War II, and the whole job is to keep the American economy strong. The National Security Council, number 18, what is the role and makeup of the National Security Council? Well, typically the president, the vice president, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury, advisors to the president are all in the NSC. And you often see that body meet in movies when we're in some type of international crisis. The presidents will call his Security Council together. And then the Intelligence Advisory Board, which was really designed to help the president fight terrorism, has been widely criticized that they haven't really done their job. The vice presidency, leading the question to number 25, throughout history, what elected office is considered to be inconsequential and of little power? The vice presidency. The sole job of the vice presidency is to be the spare, as we like to say, the extra. In England, the crown is told to have an heir and a spare, and the spare's there in case, the first son dies or the first child dies. So the vice president is kind of the spare. It's supposed to sit around and just wait, and if the president dies, you get to be the president, right? So some amendments to kind of attached to it in 1804, which is study guide question number 20. What amendment stopped the practice of the second vote getter in the Electoral College becoming vice president? And that had to do with the election of 1800 and Aaron Burr actually trying to beat Thomas Jefferson, even though he was running as his vice presidential candidate. And then Alexander Hamilton's key role in getting votes that made Jefferson president, and then eventually the duel between Hamilton and Burr that resulted in Hamilton's death. So the 12th Amendment was done to fix that problem. I mean, think about it. That would mean that it would be Donald Trump as president of the United States, and Hillary Clinton would be the vice president. And yeah, how would that go? The 25th Amendment was in 1967, and this is study guide question number 26. What amendment permits the vice president to succeed the president in times of temporary or permanent inability? And that is the 25th Amendment. It's happened, I believe, about 5 times. Bush, for example, did a couple of surgeries, nothing, kind of medical activities. And so when he was under, they used the 25th Amendment so the vice president was in power in case anything were to happen in the operating room. So really, this is to prevent maybe a president from having a stroke and then being incapacitated, which, by the way, Woodrow Wilson was, and he was still president. And frankly, his wife was actually running the show for a while because they had no way, as long as he was alive, he was still the president. So increased responsibility, both Gore and Dick Cheney, Joe Biden. Part of the growth of the 21st century president has been the growth of the 21st century vice president. And one of the big ones, and the study guide question that we'll get to on that, is the uniquely powerful role, so number 21, amongst the recent vice president, which has received the most powers? And the answer is Dick Cheney. George Bush was very clear to give Dick Cheney a ton of powers. He saw it not a co-presidency, but definitely a teamed presidency. The cabinet, not the people that work for the president to get stuff done, the cabinet are kind of an unofficial traditional role. And every president has one from Washington forward. And these are typically, political appointees. Sometimes they're very close to you, like, the Attorney General for John Kennedy was his brother, Bobby Kennedy, and they connected on civil rights, did a really good job. But then some of them may be, Obama lets Hillary Clinton be Secretary of State, his political rival, and that was all part of a deal worked out so she could get some experience in international affairs. But they were political rivals, so you use the political appointee system here to kind of form the cabinet. So it is the vice president, the heads of the executive departments, War, Treasury, State, Homeland Security, and then whoever else the president wants in the room. It's kind of basically a show group. They really don't do a whole lot. They take pictures and the president announces things. It's not the working group, it's the White House staff that's the working group. The president and Congress, the perpetual tug of war. So the president and Congress are, by definition, set opposed to each other. Uh, it's constitutionally designed. So what makes the president successful in working with conflict? In that conflict? Well, the checks and balances that we talked about in the first module are why it is difficult. And this is really the different than the parliamentary system, where the prime minister gets to run. And so ideologically and programmatically, they're supposed to carry things out. The other is that we have shared powers, that the president and Congress are often in divided governments because we also have 50 state governments. And then we have separate election cycles, the president 4 years, the Senate 6 years, the House 2 years. So in the United States, it was designed to be slow and deliberative. And in today's fast moving society, that's been a bit of a struggle because when things have to get done quickly, it's the president. And then Congress gets upset that the president is gathering too much power and tries to pull it back, but they have a hard time acting quickly. So, what makes a president successful with Congress? And part of that is they could have the same ideology. So, right now we have a Republican president and a Republican House and Senate. Foreign policy and national security issues. When we're at war, we tend to be very unified, like right after 9/11. And then the threat of a veto. The president can always say, hey, I'm going to veto that bill. It takes 60 votes to overturn it in the Senate. Typically, those votes are 60% in the House. Typically, those votes are not there. So the president can use that. And then popularity. Presidents that are very popular have immense political power. So here's the Benghazi Committee. So this is failed intelligence activity in Libya. The Honorable Hillary Rodham Clinton, Secretary of State at the time, getting grilled by a Republican Congress because they know she's running for election as presidency in 2016. So this is all part of kind of a political show at that point. This was all the jostling that we did not like. That also came out during the recent Brett Kavanaugh hearings, right? The political jostling instead of the actual relationship. So the president and the people, an evolving relationship. And we've had presidents that have been very, very close to the people, and those that have been just kind of at a distance. And so public opinion, very important. The presidents do respond to the public quite quickly. I think they're the branch that really does. And then we'll look at presidential popularity. So the framers saw the president as someone who was elite and distant, almost like one of the Socratic kings from Greek land. But more and more, the president has to be close to the people, close to popularity, close to understanding what's going on. The two-party system and then just the expanding franchise of voters have brought the president very close. And the president speaks to the public directly today through media, whether at one time that was radio with Franklin Roosevelt, and then television with Kennedy and Reagan. And today it's all about tweets and blogs and tweets from the president. So, using the media to communicate, and modern presidents try to do that on a regular day. There's a daily press briefing, and there's lots of news that's coverage, and you can't keep anything a secret in Washington. So I think the game actually is you make the leaks, that create the stories, and then you control the opinion. That's kind of the way that it's played, but nothing secret. Responding to the public, the presidents are very responsive, particularly in their first term when they know they're going to seek reelection in 4 years. And they tend to use a lot of word symbol language. When presidents go into techno speak or policy wonk talk, everybody goes to sleep. So, the president will do things like Reagan holding up a glass and going, this glass is half filled, and this is my economy. I am an optimist. and he spoke directly to the American public about Reaganomics. So presidents use symbols and images to be able to convey their message. Now, this is one of the study guide questions, number 30. What is the recent trend in presidential ratings? And I know it looks like a lot of squiggles, but all the squiggles go down, right? They go down, down, down. You start out popular like a honeymoon, and then it goes down. And you looked at virtually every president has had a downturn. So that has been a trend for some time. The big theme is that president power has increased over time, and we've let it, and then Congress will try to pull that back now and then, made marginally successful at best. So, most powerful person in the United States is the President of the United States. And so that ends our time together. And then in class, we're going to go over three things. We're going to go over the 21st century presidents in detail. We're going to, and which is essay question number 2. We're going to go over some examples of executive orders, very, very influential executive orders, and then we're going to take a deeper dive into presidential popularity. So that's all I've got, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture.